Welcome to The Machine, a podcast from Waterford Institute of Technology. My name is Rob O'Connor from the Department of Computing and Mathematics at WIT. Today we are going to talk about SEE, the Society, Economy and Environment Space Network, which is a new collaborative research effort that has begun across the south of Ireland. I'm delighted to have on the line with me today, we have Niall Smith, who is the Head of Research with CIT, that's Cork Institute of Technology, and Mark White, who is the Head of Research from Waterford Institute of Technology. How are you, lads?
How are you?
Good.
Just get a couple of housekeeping things out of the way because I'm terrible for not doing this and I always get wrapped on the knuckles. Just to let you know that we are on Twitter, machine_podcast and Machine Podcast on Facebook, and you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you like to get your podcasts. And I would also like to say hello to our pocket of listeners who are in Texas and California. How are you doing, folks? Hope you're all well. Okay, so gentlemen, Society, Economy and the Environment Space Network, the SEE Space Network. Niall, could you maybe describe what that is?
Yes, Rob, delighted to do so. So it's an exciting development, and it's a development that myself and Mark and some of our colleagues started talking about probably about a year ago now. And what we were doing was we were looking at how space is evolving, and sometimes you'll hear the phrase space 4.0, which is really a new version of the space that many people are familiar with, which includes and involves and maybe in many ways is driven by smaller companies, smaller countries. And so we got together and said, well, look, we've got a lot of expertise in various different areas. The TSSG, for example, in Waterford, are world leaders in telecommunications research. We have some world leading researchers in CIT and cyber physical systems. So we said, can we pivot that, to use a phrase that's too often used perhaps at the moment? Can we pivot those particular expertises into a way that takes advantage of this space 4.0 evolution? And what we really then wanted to do with the SEE space was we wanted to say, we don't just want this to be about space. We don't just want this to be about economy solely. We want to make a societal impact, and we want to see where we can help to protect the environment. So we really wanted this to be a rounded approach. We wanted to see where space would come in and help. I think really importantly, in terms of the conversation that we started, was that we didn't want to only involve, and we don't going forward, only involve people who think that space is cool or that they just want to do nothing but space. Actually, what we really want to do is get as many people, companies, communities starting to realize that maybe if they interface or interact with the new way that space is being done, just even a little bit, that they can use that to their advantage. And that's where this network really starts to say, we want to talk with all our stakeholders and try to get that narrative building up. So that's essentially the background, I think. That's why it's so exciting, because it's a very broad church of people we want to talk to, not a narrow vested interest group of people, which has its own place. But this is I think, much more exciting than that.
And so, Mark, your background, your background is healthcare, isn't it? Am I correct?
It is. My background is healthcare, but in my role in WIT, I would have oversight over all research. So when I started talking to Niall about this, I could see all of the doors opening up for every research interest and every discipline in WIT, because most of them will have some sort of application in the way that we were talking to Niall about space. Even our business colleagues, when we're trying to engage with, for example, some small enterprises who might want to put a product in space, our business colleagues will be able to help them in terms of their plans, in terms of their financial scoping, in terms of the business arrangements that are required. And I thought this is a great opportunity. And normally in our sector, and I know Niall won't disagree, we compete against each other, especially around European funding and national funding. But this has an opportunity to make a real impact for the research communities in both organizations as we go on our technological university journey. But more importantly, it has a big opportunity for the small to medium enterprises that we engage with in the South and Southeast region, because just like we're thinking and talking about space here today, I have no doubt that there are small to medium enterprises and business thinking, how can I get my product in space? How would my product work in space? How am I going to test my product in space? How am I going to test my service in space? So really, really big opportunities when we started talking a year ago that have just really manifested into the creation of this network, which is formal enough to keep us together, but informal enough not for us to compete against each other.
No, I'm a bit of a space nut. I'm just interested in it. It's a kind of a little hobby horse of mine. I'm wearing my NASA t-shirt as we record this podcast. And one of the things that has always fascinated me about space and space research and the space race of the 1950s and 60s were all of the tiny little bits that were involved in either putting somebody on the moon or whatever it was. It doesn't all have to be about rocket propulsion. It can be about like the Apollo 11 guidance computer is a particular hobby horse of mine, and the famous alarms that went off as they were landing. But space has kind of waned since then, and now it's on the up again. There's a huge amount of research and activity in that area. A lot of it coming from the private sector, but then I know that at the European level, at the European Commission level, they're putting an awful lot of weight and money behind this because I don't want to make a joke, but it is a new frontier. Actually, I want to play a small clip, if that's okay. I want to play a small clip. This is of Sean Kelly, the MEP Sean Kelly. I took this from the CIT website, which I think came originally from the European Union TV channel. And it's actually from an interview that Sean Kelly did with Niall about the launch of the EU's new space program. This is from December 2018, but I think it's indicative as to the level at which the European Commission are taking this seriously.
Dee Vacorda, I was delighted to host a special event here in the European Parliament this morning on space strategy and especially Ireland's role therein. And I was delighted to be joined by experts, especially from UCD and CIT, because we need to feed into what's happening here in Europe. We are developing a space strategy now for the next 7 to 10 years, and the funding streams which will go with that. And of course, we need to have the input of experts to ensure that we do that right. The regulation will stand for a number of years, so it's important that it is broadly based and that it ensures that we can make progress both at the European level but also on the global level, because the space is becoming more and more local in some respects. It has many solutions that we wouldn't have thought of up until now. And I think from an Irish point of view, we are really, now getting to grips with the opportunities that are there. And of course, we look forward to developing our white paper at national level, which will feed into what's happening.
And the full clip is available on the CIT website if you want to have a look at it. But the next person to speak is Niall Smith, who is actually on the podcast with us here. So Niall, could you maybe talk us through the thinking of the European Commission on space?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting area and really developing area. So for a long time in Europe, we have been investing a lot in technology development for spacecraft, which are kind of doing two different things. A bunch of them looking outwards, a lot of very successful missions to the European Space Agency. By the way, the European Space Agency, I should say, at the outset, is an intergovernmental organisation. Ireland has been a member from day one. But there's also an EU Commission space policy now, and this starts to get into some interesting politics around the way space is developing, which maybe come to in just in a second. But the European Space Agency has really led the charge towards technology developments for many years, and there's about 60 Irish companies that have kind of taken advantage of that in various ways over those years, over the last 25 years. But what's really started to happen was there was a view that a lot of what we take for granted as part of our daily lives, like take the sat-nav in your car or the sat-nav on your phone or whatever it is, that a lot of that was starting to use what we all love to call assets in space which don't actually belong to the European Union. So if, for example, those assets, and for example, SatNav is based upon a suite of American satellites, Europe started to get this kind of sense of, well, it's not made here. Should we be concerned about that? What if there was a change in the political direction in some other states that cut off things that we use fundamentally for our daily operations, for our competitiveness, and so on? So the EU Commission started to get really interested in the whole politics of space, but not with a large P, with sort of the small P side of things, really, and also our privacy and our security and our competitiveness. And what they were basically starting to realize, we have been realizing as a union, is that space gives the potential for competitiveness, which you can't do if you're only working on the surface of the Earth, let's say. So we had then started to try to understand a little bit about what would it be that, let's say, some of the big industries would really need. So go back to the car industry, for example. If we're going to have autonomous vehicles, one of the things that are going to be critical to autonomous vehicles is very accurate global positioning. So we need better positioning, but we can't have cars in Europe relying on somebody else's satellite suite necessarily. That's maybe something that will make one feel a little uncomfortable as one is sitting on one autonomously driven vehicle that somebody somewhere else switches off the satellite signal. So there's this really kind of sense of, it's not a protectionism, but there is definitely a sense that nevertheless, you need to control things that are fundamental to the operation in your society. So there is a space policy that the EU Commission has developed, and the European Space Agency and the European Commission, they're kind of in discussions at the moment about the best way forward for a lot of this operation. Because ESA started off as very much an organization which didn't get involved and still doesn't in defense-related issues or issues which might be considered to be sort of have a political angle associated with them. Whereas clearly our politicians in the Commission have to concern themselves with all aspects of what protects us or all access of what drives us. So at the moment, there's a really interesting conversation between the Commission and space agencies around Europe as to how best we can continue to develop interesting technologies, but also do it in a way now which maybe has a more fundamental integration with major industries that already exist, and maritime would be another example. There could be lots of examples, Rob, that we could give. So we're at that interesting point at the moment, and Ireland can play a role in that. And that's why kind of sea space also becomes interesting, because we can help to make sure that Ireland's getting a voice in that.
Well, let's maybe just go through some of those examples, because often when we talk about space, it can seem, and again, please excuse the pun, it can seem nebulous. It can seem abstract. It's off out there. It's nothing to do with me. It has no bearing on my daily life. It can't possibly have anything to do with my business because I make widgets. Widgets have nothing to do with space or whatever it is that we're involved in. So maybe let's just talk through a couple of concrete examples as to where sea space might potentially have some impacts. Mark, you're nodding your head there, so we might go to yourself. Could you maybe give me one possible example?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the most obvious for us in WIT and TSSG is the whole area of agri-tech and how we look and view the earth, the soil, and the technologies that are supporting agriculture going forward. So I was really taken there recently when a neighbor friend of mine who's a farmer was saying he's thinking of buying a satellite operated tractor and machinery. So there's one straight example from a neighbor of mine living in rural Wexford who's thinking of investing a couple of $100,000 in a piece of machinery that will probably not self-drive, but manage the way that he manages his land much more efficiently and effectively. But that's just one element of it, Rob, in the ag tech space. I mean, how we view our land and the way our land looks and operates looks completely different from space than it does from any other technology that we've been able to scan or use from the earth. And so just that one example alone opens up so many avenues, both for agriculture, technology, and research.
So what you're talking about there, if I'm correct, is you're saying that it's not necessarily, when you're talking about agri-tech, it's not necessarily about growing food in space, although I'm sure that's possibly an area that you might look at, but it's how space technology can be leveraged to allow more efficient working of a farm in Ireland by a farmer.
Absolutely.
You know, using these satellites and other things that are out there that might allow him. I know nothing about farming, right? But maybe he might plough his field one way, but actually the satellite might be able to see that if you go this different way and draw your lines differently, you might be able to get a slightly higher yield. Would it be something along those lines?
Yes, stuff like that. But more important, as you mentioned there, data. It's all about the data that we're collecting from these space observatories and low orbital satellites. Not only, and the great thing about low orbital satellites is that it's real time. It's constantly recording data, constantly capturing images, constantly scanning the environment below. So it's which is something new and different in all aspects of your daily work, not just farming, for example, but in all aspects of your work, and especially around the area of the environment. As we know, climate changes things, seasons change things on Earth, and we only have one perspective of that, and that's from where we stand. And I have no doubt that in years to come, the way that we look and view climate change and the interventions that we will leverage out of programs from space around the environment will radically change from where we are today.
Niall, would you be able to give us an example as well, maybe, of something that might be of relevance to you and your work in CIT?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example would be cybersecurity. There's a big cybersecurity, a lot of research going on in CIT, a lot of also education going on in CIT. And we're fortunate in Cork to have a number of very large cybersecurity based companies at SME and multinational level. So one of the big things, and Mark mentioned it there, it's data. And so what we're starting to see is the opportunity and the reality of more data going through these, in particular, these low Earth orbit satellites. Many of us will be familiar with the Starlink, the whole SpaceX, Elon Musk, and him putting up all of these satellites. Many of us will have seen them, I think, Rob. If you have any sort of dark skies, it's pretty much impossible not to. Now, this disturbs the astronomy community, people like myself. We talk about this in other fora and the need to protect the skies. But if we put that to one side for a second, then these satellites are designed to carry broadband to areas where they never have gone before. So that's lighting up places in Ireland. And by the way, this is something that I have to say, Rob, we need to look more closely at. Taking 7 years to roll out our broadband plan is simply not the smartest way to do it. And fibre, in my view, it needs to be augmented. It's not just my view, by the way. I think there's a good evidence base for that. It needs to be augmented by the way that we can move data already through satellite. So whether you agree with the SpaceX and that, there'll be other companies come along. But the key thing here is we're starting to see more data being moved through these constellations, as we call them, of satellites. And once you start to move data around, you start to worry about the security of that data. And you start to worry about if you don't want people actually prying on your data. So cybersecurity starts to become really important. The opportunity for us in sea space here is that there is no global standard for cybersecurity in space. A lot of the operating systems that spacecraft use in space never were considered to need to be secure because they just weren't part of an infrastructure of sensitive data or whatever necessarily, But now we're starting to see that. So we're starting to see fintech companies move data through space. Once you start to move, people's details on their money through space, you really got to be sure that's secure. So we're seeing a really rapid requirement to take data and make it secure in space. And there's very little work has been done on this. So we see this as a real opportunity. In addition, there's something I also think is kind of really interesting. I think it's really worth pointing out. That is, you can actually move data around the planet faster in space than you can do it on the surface of the planet. So when you move it around the surface of the planet, you got to go through something like copper cable or fiber optic. So fiber optic is the fastest you can do, but that already is 47% slower than you can go if you're in a vacuum. So if you're transmitting between spacecraft in a vacuum, so in space, you're basically moving 50% quicker. And although the spacecraft are a couple of 100 kilometers above you, there's been lots of simulations on this, you can move data around more quickly. that starts to get very exciting for the cybersecurity companies, because potentially they can get ahead of the hacker who is doing something using, ground-based carrier methods, fiber or cable. So and that helps them to get ahead of the hacker and to stop the hacking taking place. And interestingly, because I didn't know this kind of a couple of years ago, but I did from discussing things with people, milliseconds matter. A lot of these companies who do the cybersecurity, it's milliseconds. They just need to be ahead just enough to stop something happening. So the timing becomes critical. And the other thing that's really interesting is if you look at where we are on the south coast, the connectivity time between Europe and the US will be fastest for data sent via satellite from this part of Europe. So we have a potential sweet spot because of our geography. So we need to work on that. We need to convince people that they maybe need to look at that a bit more closely. And those conversations are starting. So that's where the cybersecurity becomes quite interesting.
Okay, so can I just stop you there, because I might want to clarify something in my own head, if that's all right. So now I remember years and years ago, back when I was working in TSSG, doing a little bit of work on, we were working in IPv6 and network transmissions, and one of the, again, geography in Ireland played a vital role because we were in that nice spot on this side of the Atlantic, so it was kind of next stop New York, and we were the first point into connectivity with mainland Europe as well. So say for something like data centers and automated trading, the data would hit potentially Galway or Kerry ever so slightly faster than it would in London or Berlin or wherever. And so if you had an automated process that would kick in, let's say the price of a stock went above or below a certain threshold, the program in Galway can respond quicker than the program in London, and it's again those milliseconds that count. That's based on wired earthbound technology. But let's say I wanted to send some financial information, okay, again, just because we're talking about time sensitive information, from Dublin to Berlin. I don't know what the physical distance is, probably about 1,000 kilometers or something like that, okay? But so if I send that across on land or land and sea, it goes through cabling that, goes maybe from here over to mainland UK and then through to mainland continental Europe. And whereas if I was able to send that data up into the sky, let's say 200 kilometers into the sky, to a satellite that can then send it 200 kilometers back down to Berlin, some of it in a vacuum or in a less dense physical space than the copper cable, it can actually do that faster. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And actually, when you even mentioned that, when you're in air, I mean, that's not quite, vacuum, but it's close enough. So the speed of light in air is pretty much the same as it is in space. So that's, again, about 50% faster. So yes, the issue that used to happen, by the way, Rob, was that we sent a lot of our data through geostationary satellites. And these are 36,000 kilometers. Now, once you're that far away, as we call it, the latency, it kills you. So, and interestingly, we have communicated these views with the Department of Communications to kind of say to them, maybe let's look. And the response that comes back usually is around latency. But the latencies are dropping. Now, it's not perfect just yet. We're at this interesting, but this is why for us in C space, it's so exciting because it's not mature yet. And we need people who are smart to solve the remaining problems. But the thing I think for people listening to the podcast to think about is this: the laws of physics mean that we can, if we're smart enough, send things quicker using this method than using the cable or fiber, because there is no way. The laws of physics tell us that you can't send stuff faster in a fiber optic cable. It's a fundamental limitation of the fiber optic cable. Fiber optic cables are brilliant. They're fantastic. They're wonderful. They've transformed so many things. But you know what? So did the steam engine up to a point, and then that got disrupted by a new technology. So we're at that kind of stage where our sort of diesel engines, if you like, our new spacecraft, they're a bit clunky at the minute, maybe compared to what we need to get them to. The fundamental laws tell us, it's worth sticking with this. And it's the same kind of comment that Mark made about worth sticking with the agri-tech type thing. We don't have all the solutions yet. It's not perfect yet. But the direction it's going, there's an inevitability about the direction it's going.
To go back to Mark's example of the farmer and the satellite assisted tractor, again, right, so I'm what you're saying about it not being mature, but this is like somebody in 1990 talking about internet technology. The internet is there, but it's maybe not out there in the public consciousness in the way that it is now, or even the way it was by the late 90s. And if there is better connectivity, better internet connectivity via satellite or some sort of space-based technology, that can benefit the farmer. Okay, the farmer mightn't be concerned about milliseconds for financial trading, but they might be able to get more live quality data through to that self-propelled tractor than they would now. I mean, even my sister lives on a farm in County Kilkenny, and they actually have satellite broadband. And, you know, it's grand, but, you know, if you want to have 2 Netflix programs going at once, you're in trouble. You know, so I can imagine the volume of data for more important things than necessarily just watching movies on Netflix is quite significant. Yeah, it's quite significant. Mark, I was looking at a figure. One of the things that I noted on the press release that was attached to the announcement of the Sea Space research grouping was that it's estimated that space and space technology will be worth around 2 trillion euros by the year 2030. I mean, how do you get your head around that, Mark?
Yeah, it's massive, isn't it? Absolutely massive. It puts everything into proportion, doesn't it? About the amount of energy and money that's being put into this into space in the next couple of years, and that's just an estimate, because some of the other traditional European funding programs, for example, even the one around the Green Deal and the environment, will pick up space-related research programs and research projects within. So that's a very safe estimate at 2 trillion. And what that means, though, for us, and again, to bring it back down to WIT and CIT, what that means for us as a region is that as the Sea Space Network starts to mature and land a couple of moderate research programs, projects, and grants, it means then that we're going to provide employment to these really clever people that Niall alluded to earlier. And this podcast is going out to students. We're trying to attract the future workforce in the whole space and technology area to the south and southeast. We want people to come and do their degrees firstly with us, but then to go on and do their masters and their PhDs in the areas of space technology and all associated and aligned disciplines as they mature into this. And it could be the next big thing for the southeast to become the space technology centre for Ireland and for Europe. It's not beyond all reasonable doubt that could happen if we can extract enough grants and enough applications out of this European money that's been red circled for the areas of space and space technology.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you think 50 years ago, let's say it's 1970, and you spoke about Ireland being world leaders in the area of telecommunications and computer security and all of these areas. I mean, people would have said, you're mad, go on out of that. Whereas here we are in 2020. Okay, it's 50 years later, but we're having this conversation and we're talking about people that we work with or are directly involved with ourselves. You know, it's quite staggering, really, and it maybe allows us to take stock of things. I'm often fascinated by stories to do with space and space technology. There's a great film I saw years ago. It's just popped into my head now, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The Dish, and The Dish it's a film set in Australia during the Apollo 11 moon landings. And it's a film about this satellite dish that was in Australia that allowed for communications, the real-time communications with the Apollo 11 mission. And it's just about the lads working there and what they were trying to do to make sure everything worked properly. And it's a good old yarn. There's lots of good Australian humour in there. But it's kind of getting me thinking about the impacts that Ireland can have on a global stage or an interstellar stage based on the work that we can do here. So there's another term that was used in the press release, and I don't know what it means. So, Niall, you might be able to explain it. Quantum communications. What's that?
Yeah, explain it a little bit, maybe, Rob. It's So one of the things that the way computers have changed over the years and the way that they are able to do calculations. The fact that we have this Moore's law, which has meant that every whatever 10 years you double, or whatever 5 years. Actually, I can't remember now what they think, but
it's about it changes, but it's about every 18 months.
Every 18 months, there's a doubling in the computing part, and so the question sort of becomes, how far can you keep on pushing that? Because at some point, the physical size of the transistors and so on becomes a problem. So quantum communications and quantum computing is really a way of doing this, which uses a fundamentally different approach to the whole thing, and uses the bizarre world of quantum mechanics. And in that bizarre world, you can influence the behavior of, for example, electrons effectively infinitely quickly using the quantum world in a way that you can't do using the traditional, cable or whatever. Even in sort of the Intel chips, and that you're still moving electrons through material. With quantum, you're actually not doing that. You're using kind of the quantum fields, so you can talk. So information in one part of the world can talk to information in another part of the world. You can clearly tell I'm not an expert on it, but the implication of it is twofold. One is there's some huge technical challenges, by the way, but one of the implications of it is that your limitations that comes from using traditional approaches disappear, and you can in principle, if you build a quantum communications machine with enough of what they call these qubits, you can really start to do calculations that at the moment might take something like 1,000 years in a second. I mean, the scale up change is mind-bogglingly fast. So we already have had some, not just in quantum computing, but the quantum communications, we already have some examples. The Chinese have already launched a satellite where they do a quantum communications connectivity from the ground to the satellite. Relatively small amounts of data at the moment, but showing the principle there. The key thing here is that you can scale that up in a way that you can't with traditional transmission technology. So if you use sort of traditional transmission algorithms and so on. So this becomes exciting because, going back to our earlier comment, if you can move things through space very quickly. Now, you still have a fundamental limitation, but I should point out something here. So the speed of light still remains the limitation, quantum computing or otherwise, in terms of how you can transmit data from A to B. But in space, you can do, at least you're doing it at the speed of light. So you no longer have the limitations provided by fiber or cable. And now with quantum computing, you have this massive computing and the possibility of the connectivity at the speed of light when you want to transmit the data that you've computed. Quantum computing could take place and you could have the data stored somewhere. But if you, for example, use your, the thing we used to use as kids, the bit of string on the end of two tin cans, then the time it will take you to transmit all of that superbly computed information will be ages, because a piece of string is a very bad way of transmitting stuff. So you need to be able to compute things fast, and you need then to be able to send it fast. So the quantum communications really addresses some of the two issues, especially if you can use space technology, or if you can use free space, which then comes back to using the space technologies. And TSSG are really good at the quantum communication side of things. That's a really bad, by the way, description, I just realized, Rob, of quantum communications. But hopefully it gives the essence, if you like, of why we're excited by it.
I read a book a couple of years ago, but I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Michio Kaku. He's a Japanese kind of popular scientist. And I think he talked about this concept of quantum entanglement. Mm-hmm. And this is where you can have two electrons that are basically doubles of each other, even though they're separated by massive distances. And whatever happens to one electron is instantaneously happens to the other electron.
Yeah.
And those might be separated 10 miles apart, 10,000 miles apart, or much further again. And I think the idea is that if you do something to that electron on Earth, that other electron could be on the moon or elsewhere. And it experiences the same thing. So if we were to think about binary information stored in electrons, as in a kind of quantum computing, you can get basically this almost instantaneous data transmission. It sounds like the stuff of science fiction. It sounds like Star Trek stuff, but it's actually almost reality.
The interesting thing, Rob, is you don't actually get the information transmission instantaneously. So you've no way of accessing what you've just done. The speed of light still remains a fundamental limitation. So, a classic example, in Newtonian physics was a question about if the sun was to disappear, how long would it take for us to know? Well, we know the sun is 8 light minutes away from us. It takes light 8 minutes to get. So we wouldn't know anything at all about what was going on with the sun for 8 minutes. Our gravity wouldn't change, the light we get, and so on, because you can't communicate between 2 points. It's a fundamental tenet of Einstein's theory of relativity, which is that there is this thing. I have to say, I still can't get my head around why there is an absolute fundamental limitation and why it has to be 3 by 10 to the 8 meters per second. But there, it is, and all the tests show us that information transmission at those rates or across the universe is limited by this speed of light phenomenon.
Wow.
And so bizarrely, by the way, and we could go off on a separate podcast, but you can actually move matter in an expanding universe faster than the speed of light, because if you expand the fabric of space-time, that can go as fast as you like. The issue then becomes you can't communicate between those two things ever. So you're not violating the law because you can't transmit between two things that have moved faster than the speed of light. So there are things in our universe already which are moving away from us faster than the speed of light. We will never be able to gain access to them. There is no way to do that. It's a bizarre thing. Anyway, we're moving into the bizarre.
No, I'd love to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm also conscious that Mark is looking at us like, what are these fools talking about?
I'm there on this podcast wondering, is Rob sorry he asked that question?
No, but I mean, even, right, so the speed of light is about, again, 300,000 kilometers per second, so something like that. I mean, it's incredibly fast. It's amazingly fast. And if we were able to get a fraction of that kind of speed on earthbound communications, well, do you know what? We're doing all right.
We're doing all right. But if we go to space, we can get the full speed.
I want to ask you to try to maybe look to the future, and look to what would you consider a win for this project. Maybe we might go to Mark first, and then to Niall. So let's say it's 2025. Okay, what impact do you see having on this physical area?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. I really love it, because every time myself and Niall meet, we come up with a brand new objective and a target for ourselves. And we've met a number of times over the last year, and we continue to meet on a monthly basis. So what we would love to happen, I mean, every time we meet, we think and talk about this, but what we would love to happen is to have a number of European funding wins that would create this and move this informal network into a much more formal arrangement between Cork and Waterford. And I'm saying Cork and Waterford, knowing that we're migrating into two separate technological universities, that we would have something much more formal that would have a big impact on the jobs, the research direction, the teaching and learning that happens in both institutes, so that we would be prepared to create this whole new something around the space region, which is the southeast coast of Ireland. So I'd love that to happen. But I know, having had the conversations with Niall, that a short-term game for us, listening to your conversations around quantum and all those things, we would love to launch, I think, a low orbital satellite to test a number of things that are going on in both colleges at the moment, including the DNA storage in microbes, and see, can we do they operate or act differently in a space environment that some of the guys in TSSG and in engineering are doing in WIT, and that some of the cybersecurity guys are already testing in CIT. So I would say within a year, we'd love to launch something ourselves. within 5 years, we'd love to win some money, enough money to have something formal and to really see some impact for the graduates and postgraduate community that are coming out of both universities, and give them some real opportunities to work and live in the region.
Just even what you're talking there, that's the kind of molecular computing area, isn't it? Again, my mind is going on that. Wow, that's staggering. Niall, what would you consider a win for the project?
I'm not sure I can do it better than Mark. Maybe to add in a comment, by the way. So when we started this conversation about a year ago, we were enthused and excited by opportunities, but we actually have been working hard to try to bring some initial structure, not just the MOU. So we have, for example, or just about at this stage now, in the spirit of the network, we have 5 PhD students working on areas related to space, and so we have been well, by the end of the year, we hopefully will have 5. We have 3 at the moment already in train. One of them is co-funded between CIT and WIT. So we've actually kind of said exactly what Mark was saying. Let's start to get some people doing. Let's start to get people working on it, because they start to talk to people. And when we go from just the theoretical to actually have people working on the ground, that makes a big difference. And having people who come through as PhD, and remember, to do a PhD, your proposal has to be assessed very rigorously. So what our PhD students are looking at matters. We're not giving money to these people just to think about space. There's particular things that they're going to have to address. More importantly, they're going to get an education which allows them to take that forward and to maybe be the leaders in our region, which will help them as the entrepreneurs to drive this on. Because it's not going to be myself and Mark. We'll play our role. We'll do our best, of course, and maybe be very excited by it. But this will build up, and again, come back to Mark's excellent summary, is if we can start to win some funding at a European level, I think that's going to be really important. And there's a lot of opportunity coming down the line. There's 15 billion euros or so in the European space area being made available by the Commission. And then there's also additional money under Horizon Europe. So there is definitely opportunity there to win some money that will allow us to accelerate what we want to do. But I wouldn't want people on the podcast to think that we're waiting, and Mark wasn't implying that. We're actually getting up and doing. So, we're actually pushing things along. It's just we feel the opportunities there to grow it exist, and we're very, very determined to take advantage of those opportunities. So in terms as well of the satellite, Mark, again, is exactly right. And for those who maybe would be less familiar with the type of costs we're talking about, you can get launch of a CubeSat, which is one of these small satellites that's roughly 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. You could launch one of those for somewhere between 80 and 100,000 euro. So the question is, how much does it cost you to put it together? 50,000 euro, 100,000, depending on exactly what you want to do. But when we look at the cost of putting a satellite that tests something that we want to do in space compared to what it would have been 10 years ago, I mean, the costs have collapsed. So 200 grand for this type of experiment is extremely good value for money. Think of the PR you get, not PR in the way maybe you might mean PR. I mean the PR instead of the excitement that it would get, that people say, yes, we can do it. And look, researchers in CIT and WIT have done this. So the entry level requirement on the funding has dropped, which allows us then to test things. It allows us in principle to test things more quickly. That builds up momentum. And I think that's why, for me, Mark's comment about us talking about the satellite is important. We want to show that you can go the whole of system approach from the experimental design right through to the implementation and the deployment in space. And we're very determined to turn that into a reality. And that's the sort of quantum of money that we're looking at. And so we'd be hopeful / confident, given the track record of our research communities, that level of funding is absolutely not beyond the bounds. Just to say, Rob, if you think about it, WIT and CIT together, I mean, our combined research income is in the mid-30s to close to 40 million a year. We're and that's even before we become TUs and add in our colleagues in our other institutions. So together, actually, it's quite a heavyweight activity. quite mature in a number of domains, the ones that we've been kind of talking about today. So to me, we're absolutely right to have this level of aspiration and indeed maybe to grow it. So I wouldn't consider the things that Mark and me have been talking about to be at all beyond the bounds at all. We don't see it that way. We see it as something which I think Mark can come in, but we'd be disappointed in a way if we don't achieve some of these aims, because I think the teams we work with are good enough to help to do that.
Also, you have to think big.
You have to think big. Yeah.
There's a phrase again that's in my mind: if you shoot for the moon, you might land on the roof, which is kind of apt considering the discussion that we're having.
Yeah.
I'd like to finish up on one point, I suppose, about space and space research and the space industry, or whatever you want to call it, which is, okay, there's a romanticism about astronauts and, the astronaut going off up to space and doing something and having adventures and whatever it is. And that's great. I'm not knocking that. But that's a tiny, tiny portion of the people who work on space and space technology. And it ultimately, from what I'm getting from the conversation between you, is that it's actually quite human. Even though we're talking about something that's, out there in the vacuum, we're talking about people working with people and exchanging ideas and exchanging information with each other in order to enhance their lives on Earth. And is that really what space technology is all about? I don't know.
Well, maybe if I start and then Mark can jump in. I mean, so it is interesting, and you mentioned earlier about the way that things evolved, and I'm old enough to remember the landing on the moon, and the whole idea of human exploration is exciting, and we will go back to the moon, and that will inspire some generations, and so it's a good thing to do. We will learn about where we come from, our origins as a species, and we may also learn to do things that in 100 years' time will be important by doing exploration. I'll come to the astronaut thing in just a second. So, for example, mining asteroids for rare materials will become important. And incidentally, Rob, Luxembourg has taken the world lead on this, and they basically said, we think mining of asteroids and other bodies is really important. And if you want to do that, come to us, because we have the financial mechanism set out. We and all of that. It's exactly what myself and Mark have been saying. Our space coast here on the south of the country, we're going to figure out what exactly is our pitch there in a similar way to Luxembourg. But so there's assets out in space for exploration that will become important in the medium or longer term. But what we're I think trying to get across today as well, and we I think feel it very acutely, is there's a huge amount of what Space 4.0 is about improving lives right now, today, here on Earth. So if you're interested, if you're listening to this podcast and you think, I've no interest in space, I want to solve poverty, for example. Well, actually, space can help you to solve poverty, and there's lots of different ways in which. So where does poverty come from? Poverty comes from, in many instances, it systemically associated with poverty is education or a lack of education. The two often go hand in hand. Education comes from access, in this case, to digital resources. That comes down to broadband at some level. You're not going to lay fibers across, for example, the middle of very large tracts of some parts of the world like Africa. You can do it from space much more easily. If we put up these mega constellations, we can light up, with no extra cost involved, underrepresented swathes of humanity. So let's do it. So let's use space to help educate people to get them out of poverty. So if you're interested in poverty, you don't have to become a space scientist, but be aware that space can help you. And don't forget that. So the astronaut side of things is something that has been important up to now. It has a role going forward. But I would say, think of space and think of your big contribution isn't necessarily to be in a 0G container a couple of 100 kilometers above the Earth. Your contribution might have more impact if your feet are firmly on the ground, but using things that are flying above you. And I think what I'm saying is, in a very long about way, is the aspiration of people listening to this, the aspiration of young people should not be, in my view, to be an astronaut. And if you don't make it, then somehow you haven't made it in the space domain. If you want to become an astronaut, that's great. But if you want to have impact, there are lots of other ways you can do it. So that, to me, is a really important message.
I think that's really important, Niall. And just to add on to that, we've just taken a really small step here by creating the network. You and I can agree on lots of things as head of research in both institutes. But what we found is that just by sparking the conversation, we've been able to get enough interest from researchers and academics in both institutions to create the network. Our next step is to try and influence others, including yourself, Robert, in the Department of Computing, so that it starts to influence the teaching and the learning. So that it's not just about the money and the research and the projects, but that we start building this ecosystem so that the people and the students who are listening, maybe, or potential students that are listening today, know that when they graduate in the south and southeast of Ireland, that they will graduate in a really rich environment that looks at space in all of its domains and disciplines, from health science, sports science, business, humanities, engineering. I mean, even we were talking, the last time we were talking with Niall, when we were talking about the low orbital satellite, we were saying, well, we could probably influence the building of that with our applied materials research centres. We could probably do something really different with low orbital satellites ourselves when we put our mind to it. So it is, the potential for this is absolutely huge, but we need the community, not just the ecosystem and the academic and research environments in Cork and in Waterford, but we need the communities to start thinking about what their own educational prospects are in this area, as Niall alluded to earlier.
Yeah, it's a great playground for conversation, because, again, to use a phrase, the sky is the limit, or the sky isn't the limit, actually. You can just, wow, I have so many ideas going off in my head. Most of them are rubbish, but I'd love to explore them. So it's wonderful to see we have the SEA Space Network, that's Society, Economy and Environment. I'd love to maybe pick up this conversation with you at some stage again in the future and see where we're at, see how the researchers are getting on, how they're contributing to projects, what kind of outputs they might have so far. That I think that would be great to follow this journey over the next couple of years, if that's agreeable with yourselves.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Absolutely.
Deli, if somebody wanted to find out a bit more about the project, is there anywhere that you would recommend they go?
So there is a website which we've starting to populate. So spacenetwork.ie is the one. I think if you type in Sea Space as well, SEE, you'll see it. So that's I think that's the port of call for us. And we would be really delighted, by the way, and it's back to some of the things that Mark has been saying, because of the way we're starting this. We love the idea that people would also come to the network, maybe through that mechanism, or to Mark directly if you're in WIT, or me in CIT, or whatever. We're really very agnostic, and that's one thing I love about this network, by the way. As Mark said earlier, we sometimes compete as institutions. Here we're this co-opetition type thing. We just see so many opportunities. But if you've a thought, if you've listened to this or whatever, you thought, well, they didn't mention something that I think that's really cool, including the things you're saying are rubbish ideas, Robert. I'm suspecting 90%. I'm suspecting none of them are rubbish. Maybe 90% of them are somewhere to go, and 10% are a bit more dodgy.
In my mind, it's rubbish.
But that's okay. It really is. Like, we really want, and Mark said it a couple of occasions, people across all domains. And if you're not sure, please come and engage in the conversation with us, and let's see. We want to facilitate. We want to take those disruptive ideas, and by definition, if they're disruptive, it means the people we've worked with so far in the network haven't thought of them. We'd love to have new disruptive ideas, and let's see where they go.
Deadly. Well, if you head on to spacenetwork.ie, the website is there. There's a bunch of stuff up on it, and over the next while it's going to be populated with even more information, and hopefully we will pick up this conversation again in the not too distant future. To Niall and Mark, thank you so much for your time today. And it's a wonderful project. It really does spark the imagination, and I wish you all the best with it.
Thanks very much, Rob.